Welcome to Sleepy Histories. Tonight we journey far back in time, beyond the bustling world you know, to a place of calm waters, warm winds, and forgotten temples. Let the soft echoes of ancient chants and the gentle rhythm of history cradle you into stillness. There is no need to rush, only to breathe, to listen, and to drift. As night falls over Tenochtitlan, let your thoughts quiet and your body sink into rest. As always, be sure to let us know in the comments what city you're listening from, and please let us know what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. Now close your eyes and let the echoes of history hush the mind. The year was 1487, and the screams of 10,000 souls pierced the dawn sky above Tenochtitlan. Their blood, still warm, cascaded down the steep steps of the Templo Mayor like crimson waterfalls, pooling in the plaza below, where obsidian knives gleamed in the morning light. The Great Pyramid stood as a monument to both divine devotion and absolute terror, a towering ziggurat of limestone and human sacrifice that would haunt the dreams of Spanish conquistadors decades later. For 4 days and 4 nights, the ceremony continued, an orgy of ritual violence that consecrated the expanded temple and announced to the world that the Aztec Empire had reached the zenith of its power. The air itself seemed to thicken with the metallic scent of death, while vultures circled overhead like harbingers of the apocalypse that would soon consume this magnificent civilization. But empires built on blood often drown in it, and the very foundations of Aztec supremacy contained the seeds of their apocalyptic destruction. Within 34 years, this greatest city in the Americas would lie in ruins, its temples toppled, its canals choked with corpses, and its emperor dead in chains. A civilization erased so completely that even its real name would be forgotten, replaced by the alien term Aztec imposed by their conquerors. The Mexica people, who would become known to history as the Aztecs, arrived in the Valley of Mexico as refugees, wandering nomads carrying little more than the prophecy of their patron god Huitzilopochtli and the haunting memory of a homeland they called Aztlan, the place of whiteness. They were the last of the great migrations, arriving in a landscape already crowded with established city-states, their advanced neighbors viewing them as little more than barbarian interlopers, whose very presence defiled the sacred waters of Lake Texcoco. According to their creation myth, they had emerged from the 7 caves of Chicamostoc, but the truth was far grimmer. They were survivors of political collapse further north, displaced peoples seeking sanctuary in an unforgiving new world that had no place for the dispossessed. For generations, they lived as vassals and mercenaries, their warriors for hire fighting other people's wars while dwelling in the marshy outskirts of Lake Texcoco. The lake itself was both blessing and curse, a shimmering expanse of blue that reflected snow-capped volcanoes and floating gardens, yet also a trap that left them vulnerable to the whims of more powerful neighbors. They were forced to pay tribute in the form of their own flesh, their children sent as slaves to satisfy the appetites of their overlords, their young men conscripted to die in foreign wars, their women taken as concubines for alien nobles. The Mexica learned early that survival demanded cunning as much as courage, that the weak must become wolves to avoid being devoured by them. The transformation began with necessity and was forged in the crucible of humiliation. Faced with extinction, the Mexica learned to weaponize their desperation, turning their marginal status into an advantage. They became students of their enemies' weaknesses, masters of political intrigue, and eventually the most feared warriors in Mesoamerica. Their military philosophy evolved from simple survival to systematic conquest, as they discovered that fear could accomplish what force alone could not. They learned to read the political winds of the valley, to exploit the jealousies and rivalries between established powers, and to present themselves as indispensable allies to those who had once scorned them. The founding of Tenochtitlan in 1325 marked their metamorphosis from refugees to conquerors. According to legend, they witnessed an eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus, devouring a serpent, the divine sign that marked their promised land. But the reality was more pragmatic and far more desperate. They chose an island in the western part of Lake Texcoco because it was the only land their enemies would allow them to occupy, a swampy outcropping that no one else wanted. What seemed like exile became their fortress. Isolation transformed into strength. The island's natural defenses would prove crucial to their survival. But more importantly, its position in the heart of the lake's trading networks would eventually make them wealthy beyond their ancestors' wildest dreams. From their island stronghold, the Mexica began to construct one of the most sophisticated urban centers in the world. They engineered floating gardens called chinampas, transforming the lake's shallow waters into fertile agricultural plots that could feed a growing population. These artificial islands, built from mud and vegetation anchored by willow trees, created a verdant landscape that Spanish chroniclers would later compare to Venice. But unlike Venice's romantic canals, Tenochtitlan's waterways served a darker purpose. They were the arteries through which tribute flowed into the heart of an empire built on systematic exploitation. The city rose from the water like a fever dream, its white limestone pyramids and palaces connected by causeways that could be destroyed at a moment's notice, turning the capital into an impregnable island fortress. The engineering marvels extended far beyond the chinampas. The Mexica constructed a complex system of dikes and levees to control the lake's water levels, preventing the periodic flooding that had plagued earlier settlements. They built aqueducts that brought fresh water from mountain springs across miles of lake and marsh, ensuring that their growing population would never thirst. The city's layout reflected their cosmic worldview, with the Templo Mayor at its sacred center and 4 great causeways extending toward the cardinal directions, dividing the urban space into the 4 quarters that mirrored their understanding of the universe itself. But perhaps most remarkably, they created a society that was simultaneously rigidly hierarchical and surprisingly meritocratic. While birth determined one's initial social position, the Mexica developed institutions that allowed for remarkable social mobility, particularly through military service and religious devotion. A commoner who distinguished himself in battle could rise to join the ranks of the Eagle and Jaguar Knights, earning not just prestige, but also the right to wear distinctive costumes, receive tribute from conquered lands, and educate his children in the exclusive schools reserved for the nobility. This system created a warrior culture of extraordinary intensity, where young men willingly risked everything for the chance to capture enemies for sacrifice and thus elevate their entire lineages. The Triple Alliance, forged in 1428 between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, represented the Mexica's masterstroke of political engineering. This confederation allowed them to project power far beyond their island home while maintaining the fiction that they were merely the senior partners in a voluntary association. In reality, it was the beginning of their imperial project, a systematic campaign of conquest that would eventually encompass territories from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. The alliance was born from a successful revolt against the Tepanec Empire of Azcapotzalco, but it quickly evolved into something far more ambitious, a mechanism for transforming the entire political landscape of Mesoamerica. The genius of the Triple Alliance lay not just in its military efficiency, but in its political sophistication. By sharing the burdens and benefits of conquest with their partners, the Mexica avoided the trap that had destroyed previous empires, the tendency to exhaust themselves trying to control too much territory with too few resources. Instead, they created a system where local rulers could maintain their positions and dignity as long as they acknowledged Mexica's supremacy and provided regular tribute. This arrangement was mutually beneficial. The subject rulers retained their authority and avoided the chaos of conquest, while the Mexica gained wealth and prestige without the administrative burden of direct rule. Aztec warfare was unlike anything the world had seen. a carefully orchestrated combination of religious ritual, psychological terror, and military precision. Their armies moved like deadly serpents across the landscape, striking with precision and withdrawing before enemies could mount effective counterattacks. Warriors were organized into elite units with names that struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. The Jaguar Knights and Eagle Warriors, men who had proven their valor by capturing prisoners for sacrifice. These warrior priests wore elaborate costumes that transformed them into living embodiments of their patron deities, complete with feathered headdresses, obsidian-studded clubs, and shields decorated with precious stones and exotic plumes. But perhaps most terrifying was their use of the tlahuistli, elaborate military costumes that transformed soldiers into living embodiments of gods and monsters. Psychological weapons designed to shatter enemy morale before the first obsidian blade was drawn. These weren't mere decorations, but carefully crafted instruments of terror, each telling a story of divine power and supernatural menace. A warrior dressed as Tlaloc, the rain god, brought with him the promise of storms and floods, while those wearing jaguar pelts seemed to embody the predatory power of the jungle itself. The sight of an Aztec army approaching, with its ranks of costumed warriors moving in perfect formation while conch shells wailed and drums thundered, was enough to make many enemies surrender without a fight. The Mexica also revolutionized the conduct of warfare itself. Unlike their neighbors, who often fought for territory or resources, the Aztecs waged war primarily for captives. Their military tactics were designed not to kill enemies, but to capture them alive, requiring a level of skill and coordination that few other armies could match. Warriors carried specialized weapons, clubs with obsidian blades sharp enough to decapitate a horse, but designed to wound rather than kill, lassos and nets for entangling opponents, and shields that could be used both defensively and as weapons in their own right. This emphasis on capture over killing created a warrior culture of extraordinary sophistication, where combat became a deadly dance requiring split-second timing and perfect coordination. The empire's expansion was driven by an insatiable hunger for tribute and victims, but also by a religious cosmology that demanded constant renewal through sacrifice. Each conquered city-state was forced to provide not only goods, gold, precious stones, exotic feathers and textiles, but also human beings for the sacrificial altars. The tribute lists, recorded in their intricate pictographic writing system, read like inventories of suffering. So many loads of cacao, so many bolts of cotton, so many live warriors for the next festival of flaying. These documents, painted on bark paper and jealously guarded by imperial scribes, reveal the systematic nature of Aztec exploitation and the bureaucratic efficiency with which they managed their empire of terror. The most disturbing aspect of these tribute lists was their casual enumeration of human lives alongside material goods. A typical entry might list 400 cotton mantles, 20 bags of cacao beans, and 40 young warriors for sacrifice, as if human beings were simply another form of commodity to be collected and consumed. This bureaucratization of human suffering reveals something profound about Aztec society. Their ability to systematize and rationalize even the most horrific aspects of their culture, turning murder into ritual and exploitation into religious duty. At the height of their power, the Aztecs controlled an empire that stretched across modern-day central Mexico, ruling over perhaps 15 million people. Tenochtitlan itself had grown into a metropolis of over 200,000 inhabitants, larger than any European city of its time. The city's markets buzzed with merchants from across Mesoamerica, trading everything from Caribbean shells to highland obsidian, from tropical bird feathers to Arctic fox pelts obtained through chains of trade that stretched from Alaska to Panama. The great market of Tlatelolco, connected to Tenochtitlan by a causeway, was said to accommodate 60,000 traders on market days, creating a babel of languages and a riot of colors that amazed even hardened Spanish conquistadors. The smell of copal incense mingled with the aroma of roasting maize, and the metallic tang of blood from the temples, creating an olfactory signature unique to the Aztec capital. Visitors described walking through clouds of fragrant smoke that rose from countless braziers, while the sound of conch shells and wooden drums provided a constant percussion that echoed off the city's stone facades. At night, the city glowed with the light of thousands of torches and braziers, their flames reflecting off the lake's dark waters and creating a luminous web that could be seen from the surrounding mountains. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity lay the empire's fatal weakness. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Aztec provinces were not fully integrated into the imperial system, remaining what historian Matthew Restall has described as an informal type of empire, based more on tribute extraction than political integration. The empire was ethnically very diverse, like most European empires, but was more a system of tributes than a single unitary form of government unlike them. The conquered peoples remained restive, bound to their overlords only by fear and force. The Aztecs had created an empire without a nation, a political structure that depended entirely on the continued ability to project overwhelming military power. This structural weakness was compounded by the Mexica's own success. As their empire expanded, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the personal relationships and face-to-face negotiations that had made their early diplomacy so effective. Distance and scale transformed what had been a confederation of allies into a machine for extracting wealth from resentful subjects. The tribute system that had once seemed like a reasonable exchange, protection for payment, gradually evolved into naked exploitation as the demands became heavier and the benefits more abstract. The Mexica also made a crucial strategic error in their treatment of the Tlaxcalteca, a confederation of city-states that had successfully resisted Aztec conquest for decades. Rather than finding a way to incorporate these skilled warriors into their empire, the Aztecs chose to maintain them as enemies, using them as a source of captives for sacrifice through ritualized conflicts known as flower wars. This decision, born from religious necessity and imperial arrogance, would prove catastrophic when the Spanish arrived and found in the Tlaxcalteca natural allies hungry for revenge against their Aztec oppressors. The signs of doom began to manifest in the early 16th century, appearing first as subtle disruptions in the natural order that gradually escalated into unmistakable omens of disaster. Strange comets blazed across the night sky like wounds torn in the fabric of heaven itself, their tails stretching across constellations and casting an eerie light that made the lake's waters look like blood. Trees began to speak, delivering cryptic warnings in voices that made listeners' blood run cold. Birds arrived, carrying messages tied to their legs, messages written in unknown scripts that seemed to burn the eyes of those who tried to read them. The normally pragmatic Aztec leadership found themselves paralyzed by supernatural dread, consulting their priests and soothsayers with increasing desperation. The calendar priests, masters of the complex mathematical systems that governed Mexican religious life, discovered disturbing patterns in their calculations, convergences of cycles that hadn't occurred for centuries, combinations of numbers that seemed to predict the end of their cosmic age. Temple priests reported that the sacred fires, which had burned continuously for generations, began guttering and dying for no apparent reason, requiring increasingly elaborate rituals to keep them alive. Most disturbing of all were the dreams that began plaguing the Emperor Montezuma II and his closest advisors. Night after night, they were visited by visions of strangers with pale skin and hair on their faces, riding beasts that seemed like deer but were larger and more terrible. These dream strangers wielded weapons that spat fire and thunder, wore metal clothing that turned aside obsidian blades, and spoke in tongues that hurt the ears to hear. The dreams were so vivid and consistent that the emperor began sending expeditions to the eastern shores, searching for any sign that these visions might be more than mere nightmares. When Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of Mexico in 1519, he brought with him not just steel and gunpowder, but something far more devastating: the accumulated resentment of the empire's subject peoples, and an intuitive understanding of the political fractures that riddled Aztec society. The Spanish conquistador was a political genius who grasped immediately that the Aztec Empire's strength was also its weakness. He didn't need to defeat 15 million people. He only needed to convince them to defeat themselves. As historian Matthew Restall has noted, conquistadors were not paid, regular, trained soldiers, but rather armed entrepreneurs who succeeded through cunning and opportunism rather than military superiority. Cortés understood something that many historians have missed. The Spanish conquest was not a collision between two civilizations, but rather the climax of indigenous political conflicts that had been building for generations. The conquistadors didn't destroy the Aztec Empire. They became the focal point around which its enemies organized to destroy it themselves. This realization transforms our understanding of the conquest from a simple tale of European technological superiority to a complex story of political revolution, in which the Spanish played the role of catalyst rather than primary agent. The initial encounters between Spanish and Mexican forces revealed both the opportunities and dangers inherent in this clash of worlds. The Spanish possessed undeniable technological advantages: steel weapons that could slice through indigenous armor, firearms that seemed to command thunder and lightning, and horses that transformed warfare into something resembling the supernatural. But the Mexica quickly adapted to these new realities, learning to kill horses by targeting their legs, to avoid the devastating effects of cannon by dispersing their forces, and to counter Spanish steel with tactics designed to exploit the invaders' weaknesses. More importantly, both sides recognized that this conflict would be decided by politics rather than technology. Cortés immediately set about recruiting allies from among the Aztec Empire's enemies and discontented subjects, while Montezuma attempted to maintain imperial unity through a combination of traditional diplomacy and supernatural intimidation. The emperor's initial decision to welcome the Spanish as possible gods rather than obvious enemies reflected not naivety, but a sophisticated attempt to neutralize the threat through incorporation, a strategy that had worked successfully with previous challenges to Aztec supremacy. The psychological warfare that accompanied the military conflict was perhaps even more significant than the battles themselves. The Spanish arrival had shattered fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. For a people whose worldview was built around cycles of time and the eternal return of familiar patterns, the appearance of genuinely alien beings represented a cosmic catastrophe that called everything into question. If pale-skinned strangers could emerge from the eastern sea riding impossible beasts, what other certainties might prove illusory? The siege of Tenochtitlan, which began in May 1521, was not a battle between Spanish and Aztec forces, but rather a civil war in which the conquistadors served as catalysts for indigenous rebellion. Tens of thousands of Tlaxcalteca, Texcocans, and other indigenous warriors joined the Spanish cause, seeing in Cortés their chance for revenge against their Aztec oppressors. The lake that had once protected the island city became its tomb as Spanish brigantines, constructed with indigenous labor and crewed by indigenous warriors, cut off all supply lines to the capital. The final assault was an exercise in systematic destruction that reveals the true nature of the conquest. Building by building, district by district, the Spanish and their allies demolished the magnificent city not to capture it, but to erase it entirely. The floating gardens were burned, their careful engineering destroyed in an orgy of vengeance that eliminated decades of agricultural innovation. The temples were toppled with a methodical thoroughness that spoke of deep religious hatred as well as political calculation. The canals were filled with rubble and corpses, transforming the Venice of the Americas into a pestilent swamp. Montezuma II, the once mighty emperor who had ruled an empire stretching from sea to sea, died in captivity, whether killed by stones thrown by his own people during a desperate attempt to restore order, or murdered by Spanish guards who found him inconvenient, remains a mystery that historians continue to debate. His death symbolized the complete collapse of not just political authority, but cosmic order itself. The man who had been the living embodiment of divine power, the intermediary between gods and mortals, died as a prisoner and a failure. His body thrown into the lake that had once reflected his glory. But perhaps the most devastating weapon in the Spanish arsenal was invisible: disease. Smallpox, typhus, measles, and other old-world pathogens swept through the indigenous population like wildfire through dry grass, killing with the efficiency that no army could match. Within a generation, the population of central Mexico had collapsed by perhaps 90%, transforming a densely populated landscape into a haunted wasteland, dotted with empty cities and abandoned fields. Entire communities simply vanished, leaving behind only crumbling buildings and overgrown gardens as testament to their existence. The demographic catastrophe was accompanied by cultural annihilation on an almost unimaginable scale. Spanish missionaries, convinced that indigenous religions were literally demonic, systematically destroyed temples, codices, and religious artifacts with a thoroughness that bordered on the pathological. Thousands of books written in indigenous scripts were burned as works of the devil, eliminating centuries of accumulated knowledge about astronomy, medicine, history, and literature. Indigenous nobles were forced to send their children to Spanish schools, where they were forbidden to speak their native languages or practice their ancestral customs. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. The Aztecs had built their world-view around the concept of cyclical time, believing that their empire was part of an eternal cosmic order that would endure forever through endless repetitions of familiar patterns. The Spanish conquest shattered this understanding completely, revealing their gods as powerless and their sacrifices as meaningless. The survivors found themselves living in a universe where the fundamental rules had changed, where the old certainties had crumbled into dust, and where the very categories through which they understood reality no longer applied. In the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish built their own capital, constructing the Cathedral of Mexico City directly atop the demolished Templo Maya. The stones of the ancient temple became the foundation of the new Christian church, a powerful symbol of cultural conquest that persists to this day. Archaeological excavations in the 20th century revealed the extent of this symbolic violence. Christian altars built directly over Aztec sacrificial stones, Spanish governmental buildings erected on the foundations of indigenous palaces, and European-style plazas carved out of sacred indigenous spaces. The defeat was not merely military or political, it was ontological. A complete destruction of one worldview and its replacement by another. The surviving Mexica found themselves forced to reconstruct their identity within categories imposed by their conquerors, to translate their experiences into Spanish concepts that often had no equivalent in their own culture. They became Indians rather than Mexica, pagans rather than followers of ancient wisdom, subjects rather than citizens of sovereign communities. Yet the conquest was never as complete as either Spanish or Aztec leaders claimed. In the villages and countryside, indigenous communities found ways to preserve essential elements of their culture while adapting to colonial rule. They learned to hide ancient rituals within Christian ceremonies, to preserve traditional knowledge within apparently Spanish institutions, and to maintain social structures that seemed to conform to colonial expectations while actually serving indigenous purposes. This cultural resistance, invisible to most Spanish observers, ensured that crucial elements of Mesoamerican civilization would survive into the modern era. The Aztec Empire's collapse reveals the fragility of all political systems built on coercion rather than consent. Their sophisticated military machine, their elaborate bureaucracy, and their awe-inspiring monuments could not compensate for the fundamental instability of an empire that had never transformed conquest into legitimate governance. They had created a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and terrible cruelty, a testament to both human achievement and human brutality that continues to haunt our understanding of what civilization means. Modern archaeology continues to reveal new aspects of Aztec civilization that complicate simple narratives of barbarism and conquest. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of sophisticated medical knowledge, including successful skull surgeries and effective treatments for various ailments. The excavation of the Aztec spiritual center, the Templo Maya, by archaeologist Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, provided otherwise unknowable information about the religion and society of the post-classical Mesoamerican Empire. Their mathematical and astronomical knowledge rivaled that of any contemporary civilization, while their artistic achievements in sculpture, painting, and architecture remain unparalleled in the Americas. Their agricultural innovations, particularly the Chinampa system of floating gardens, represented one of the most productive and sustainable farming methods ever developed. These artificial islands could produce up to 7 crops per year, while simultaneously serving as aquaculture systems for raising fish and waterfowl. The productivity of this system was so extraordinary that it continued to supply Mexico City with food well into the colonial period. Despite Spanish efforts to replace it with European agricultural methods, the Aztec educational system was remarkably sophisticated and inclusive by the standards of its time. While European schools were generally restricted to the wealthy and the clergy, Aztec society maintained schools for both nobles and commoners, with different curricula designed to prepare students for their roles in society. The Kamacac, schools for the nobility, provided intensive education in history, law, astronomy, and religious practice, while the Telpochcali, schools for commoners, focused on military training, basic literacy, and practical skills. This system produced literacy rates that may have been higher than those in contemporary Europe. Their legacy lives on in the millions of Nahuatl speakers who still inhabit central Mexico, in the foods they domesticated that now feed the world, and in the artistic traditions that continue to inspire contemporary Mexican culture. Chocolate, tomatoes, potatoes, corn, and countless other crops that are now staples of global cuisine were first cultivated and refined by Mesoamerican peoples under Aztec rule. The techniques they developed for processing these foods, from nixtamalization of corn to the fermentation of cacao, represent crucial contributions to human knowledge that continue to benefit people worldwide. Yet the most haunting aspect of their story may be how quickly it all ended. An empire that had dominated Mesoamerica for nearly a century, that had seemed as permanent as the mountains surrounding their capital, vanished in less than 2 years. The speed of the collapse suggests something profound about the nature of political power itself. How quickly certainties can become illusions. How rapidly the seemingly invincible can be revealed as tragically vulnerable. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured during the final assault on Tenochtitlan and subjected to torture by the Spanish, who hoped to extract information about hidden treasures. Even under the most excruciating torment, his feet were burned with oil while Spanish soldiers questioned him about gold. He revealed nothing, taking the secrets of his people's wealth to his grave. His stoic endurance in the face of agony became a symbol of indigenous resistance that continues to inspire Mexican nationalism to this day. The screams that had once echoed from the Templo Maya fell silent, replaced by the tolling of church bells and the prayers of Spanish priests. The city of Tenochtitlan, which had been the jewel of the Americas, became a memory preserved only in the chronicles of its conquerors and the oral traditions of its scattered survivors. The Great Pyramid, where thousands had died in ritual sacrifice, was dismantled stone by stone, its blocks used to build the foundations of a European city that would rise from its ruins. The lake itself began to disappear, drained by Spanish engineers who saw it as an obstacle to European-style development rather than the foundation of a sophisticated hydraulic civilization. The Chinampas were abandoned, their careful engineering allowed to decay as Spanish agriculture replaced indigenous farming methods. The causeway cities that had once connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland crumbled into ruins, their populations dispersed or dead from disease and violence. And in the deepest foundations of Mexico City, buried beneath centuries of colonial construction and modern development, the bones of 10,000 sacrificial victims still lie entombed in the ruins of the Great Temple. Their silent testimony to an empire that chose to rule through terror and discovered too late that fear alone cannot sustain a civilization forever. The irony is profound and terrible. A people who had believed that human sacrifice was necessary to maintain cosmic order became themselves the ultimate sacrifice, offered up to gods they had never imagined on altars built from the ruins of their own temples. The Aztec Empire had risen from the ashes of exile to become the most powerful force in Mesoamerica, only to discover that the gods they had fed with human hearts had appetites that could never be satisfied. And when Spanish conquistadors arrived bearing diseases as invisible and deadly as their own obsidian knives, those same gods smiled and prepared to feast on an entire civilization.